see, ELINT, the last commercial space frontier, right? So this is just a quick snapshot of 45 million geolocations that we've picked up, and we've done even more since February of 2019. You'll see some of the signals of interest that we're able to identify in here. And as Jeff mentioned in talking about, what is ELINT and what is, what we've called RF GeoInt for some time now. So as a subset of SIGINT, what we really do, Hawkeye as a company, is what I would describe as something between tech ELINT and op ELINT, in the sense that we're very, very proficient at geolocating specific signals, specific emitters of interest that may provide further insights to a lot of our customers. At the same time, there's a lot we can do as a commercial provider for providing characteristics of these, whether they be radio protocols or more specific attributes that you can identify from a radar, for instance. So all of this is within the realm of possible from a commercial data set. Some of the applications you'll see for this go into some of your more conventional uses of ELINT, to include developing electronic orders of battle as an example of what that capability has traditionally been used for. So how do we do it, right? For folks who haven't already seen sort of our general brief, or I think there's a video posted as well with the handout, we own and operate the hardware, right? We have satellites flying in clusters of 3 on polar orbits around the Earth, and each satellite independently geolocates a wide variety of signals. So we tune these SDRs to a specific frequency, and we use time difference and frequency difference on arrival, along with our engineers using proprietary algorithms with several different capabilities to independently geolocate and then combine what we call the single burst geolocations into a high confidence multi-burst geolocation along with the associated data. This is particularly useful in doing from low Earth orbit because of the swath that we can achieve in a given pass, which does vary by SOI, and we'll talk about that in some depth. This is what the data actually looks like when it's typically received and projected into a GIS. So essentially the data typically includes a bunch of metadata that we'll talk about, but the actual visualization of the data typically has a center point, a lat long, a semi-minor, and a semi-major axis that make up the confidence ellipse. There's a lot of factors that go into our ability to really bring that confidence ellipse into a tight, accurate geolocation. Some things are the emitter itself, how much power output, the environment that emitter is behaving in, right, is in a high signal to noise ratio area, in which case it's going to be harder to pick out amongst the noise. What our hardware constraints are, what antenna we're using, the angle and orbital geometry as we come overhead, how consistent and for how long that emitter is emitting. So there are a number of factors. This varies a lot by SOI, but our engineers have done an amazing job at turning this into a real science and developing high accuracy geolocations, which are delivered in a GeoJSON format that is open standard, usable across any number of GIS tools. So I spoke a little bit about metadata. So as some examples of some of the SOIs we've developed and been able to consistently geolocate so far, you'll see examples on here ranging from VHF push-to-talk to GPS interference as one of our more recent developments. We cover the whole or most of the spectrum from 144 megahertz to 15 gigahertz, with plans to close that gap as we continue to launch additional clusters into 2022 and 2023. And what you'll find is that our current system can cover much of the RF spectrum. Where we really like to work with customers and further refine that capability is in developing the actual capability to process and geolocate detected emissions, right? So at a given time, we may be able to cover a certain end of the spectrum, but just don't know if customers are interested in a specific signal of interest or haven't actually used our processing algorithms to productize that signal. And that's something we're constantly looking to work with government or other customers to identify what are those signals of interest. Are there test emitters available that we can use and refine our algorithms to further develop accuracies and larger volume of collections. For some of these different SOIs, you're going to have varying metadata available. So that may range from, for instance, the center frequency and channel that's being utilized, the radio protocol in the case of, UHF, where we may be able to tell you that it's an MPT 123 or a DMR radio, the provider for L-band, or in the case of radars, often able to provide, the pulse repetition rate, pulse repetition interval, and some of the more unique characteristics of the given emitter. Here you're seeing a visual of our constellation expansion plan. So obviously there's a lot that happens as constellations expand. If we know for our tactical end users, particularly for the government, it's vital to drive down latency and to drive up revisit. And the way to achieve that is, a number of ways. One of which is continuing to launch with an aggressive plan to have multiple clusters on orbit making up our full constellation, so that we can drive down, I think in the next year, our revisit rate to a given point on the Earth to less than 45 minutes ideally. As far as reducing latencies, there's a number of ways to do that, and I can talk through what our current architecture is for downlink, but we're agnostic to doing any solution at bringing those latencies down, whether that's crosslink for dedicated downlinks, mid-latitude downlinks, direct downlinks, anything we can do, even onboard processing of data to reduce those latencies and make our data usable for folks that have really tight timelines for decision making is something we're looking to do, and we're actively progressing on. To give an idea of the swath that our system can provide, we've got our regional awareness subscriptions, or RASs as we call them, on here. And so in these examples, you see areas that we're consistently collecting typically the same SOIs every day on a consistent basis, which obviously does a lot for end users as far as establishing those RF or ELINT baselines, doing things like change detection, looking for anomalies. So right now, we support a number of these throughout the planet in areas of high interest. In this case, you're looking at the Mediterranean and the Middle East, along with the South China Sea and East China. So areas of strategic interest that we know there are lots of folks that are interested in. And as far as swath, you're seeing some examples there in the circle. Those are typically some of our smaller swath collections, smaller being a very relative term when we're talking about, in these cases, probably upwards of 3 million square kilometers at a given time, typically for X-band and S-band radar. And then the larger square you're seeing is a projection of approximately 7 to 10 million square kilometers, which is typically the swath we're seeing for VHF, L-band, or some of the other SOIs in that same range. So how is RF enhancing geospatial intelligence specifically, right? So RF is not something that occurs naturally in nature, right? When you see RF activity, it's typically identifying an area of human activity and providing further characterization to that. In particular, it's been very useful within the maritime domain for maritime domain awareness, locating anomalies in dark vessels, coupling our data with other data sources such as AIS to show where there's activity that isn't being reported and can potentially be nefarious. Pattern of life behavior in particular. I think as we arrive at further constellations on orbit and increase our revisit, and as we collect over strategic areas of interest on a more consistent basis, we're going to further enable both human-generated and AI/ML-generated pattern of life analyses, where you're able to look and identify deviations. We did this particularly well, I think, in the wake of COVID, in some vignettes that our company released, looking at ports of interest in China or Italy, looking at recovery and maritime traffic, and looking at that against, what some nation states are reporting in public arenas. Increasing usability of other sensing modalities. So a lot of what we do, especially for defense and IC customers, is tipping and queuing of other assets, right? There's a limit to what is available, the resource availability when it comes to, say, EO, SAR, other platforms. And so using something that has a swath like RF, where we talk about 3 to 10 million square kilometers at a given time, to then generate more specific or targeted areas of interest that can be used to push those assets and allocate those resources to is a massive value added, both in terms of the efficiency of collection, from a cost-saving standpoint, and operationally in terms of increasing the effectiveness of those assets. And then last, here talking about IUU fishing, right? Our data is, as though it's very applicable to defense, and that's where I've been largely focused. There's a lot of sustainability and other, very important aspects that our technology can be applicable to. In addition to IUU fishing, identifying poaching is something we've been looking at. Illegal logging operations or dredging are all things that our technology can be used by governments, NGOs, and other folks to support. So going beyond data as a service, I think our CEO was actually quoted in a podcast with via satellite talking about, you can't be a part-time data provider. And this is why I love my role, as the director of mission support, focused a lot on embedding with customers, looking at the actual services and analytics that we provide to help bridge that gap, as I mentioned, between government requirements and commercial capabilities. And what are we actually talking about when we do this? We've done everything from building out data analytics that can be then put into other platforms that are currently used, in addition to building our own platform to fill some of the gaps that we've identified for end users in utilizing ELINT and RFGOINT currently. In my personal opinion, I think some of the next steps is really going to be getting on top of fusing our data with both unclassified and classified data sets to truly unleash the power of commercial ELINT. We're doing this with some limited customers now, but one of the big constraints that I see currently is just getting the data to the right folks with the right training, getting access to those customers to get feedback on what we can do to both improve the data and the analytics. But all of this is something that Hawkeye wants to be intimately involved with to make sure that our data is valuable to those end users. So this next slide here, I think it's important to point out that the order here doesn't necessarily need to be in this order, right? So as a foundational data set, RFGOINT ELINT is vital, right? The raw data itself has some phenomenal insights that can be further developed depending on the capabilities and specific mission set of the end user. But our RFGeo, our primary geolocation product, as an asset to fuse with EO, with SAR, with some of with hyperspectral, all the other capabilities that are out there, I think is really where the value add can be. In particular, I think we've heard this from a lot of end users, really developing the workflows and automating those workflows such that we're using ML and AI to identify when there's something new of interest, and then automatically, without a human in the loop, tipping and queuing those other assets, whether they may even be a imagery tip to an RF sensor in some cases, to automatically change a collection plan and refine that insight as it's developed. I think, and I'll show a couple vignettes here at the end. In particular, lately, I think the workflow has typically been that we identify something of interest based on the tasking of our system, which often is informed by geopolitical events, and then use a imagery provider to further characterize what's been found there. I think as the technology develops, as Hawkeye gets more access to end users and further refines our offerings, you'll start to see that change a lot in cases where you may have imagery tipping and queuing an RF asset. So I definitely want to highlight here, shareability and releasability. As I mentioned before, specific with the USG's, one of the USG's primary strategies for great power competition being the enabling of our partner forces, shareability and releasability is of massive importance. And so the fact that we're doing this as a commercial company that can, keep this data unclassified and shareable with partner forces is of incredible utility. Having a data set that you can fuse, that you can work with partner forces, you can train them on and sensitize them to requirements is really important. From an affordability standpoint, I'll say that having done a lot of work with multi-airborne platforms, the swath is obviously a major advantage, and really what I like to get the point across on is that it's complementary to other capabilities at a fraction of the cost. Your ability to, say, do a pre-deployment site survey of a given area and identify what RF activity is already ongoing there so that you can tune your more sophisticated asset that you're going to be flying there is massive, right? Providing start points for the other, whether they be ground-based or air-based capabilities to go look at that can't look at 3 million, 10 million square kilometers at a time, is going to really, really be a good steward of government, or private resources when it comes to using our data with other data sets. For assured access and reliability, we're seeing an increased importance with some of our customers on what's been deemed a hybrid space architecture, right? So we know in great power competition that, we may lose access to some, national collection assets that would otherwise have been used to provide a capability. And so being able to have a backbone of commercial providers that are already integrated into that hybrid space architecture and provide that level of resiliency is massive. So on the next couple slides here, I know I want to get to leave some time for Q&A as well. I'll quickly go through a couple of vignettes, and I'm happy to touch base more on these for folks, just to show that we have an abundance of teams that are actively working to develop insights, both based on our customers' individual needs, as well as interest across the industry for global events where we know that folks want to know what is going on and want to see what commercial can bring to the table. So in this instance, looking at the Chinese-India border, imagery, tipping, and queuing an RF asset. So I definitely want to highlight here, shareability and releasability. As I mentioned before, specific with the USG's, one of the USG's primary strategies for great power competition being the enabling of our partner forces, shareability and releasability is of massive importance. And so the fact that we're doing this as a commercial company that can, keep this data unclassified and shareable with partner forces is of incredible utility. Having a data set that you can fuse, that you can work with partner forces, you can train them on and sensitize them to requirements is really important. From an affordability standpoint, I'll say that having done a lot of work with multi-airborne platforms, the swath is obviously a major advantage, and really what I like to get the point across on is that it's complementary to other capabilities at a fraction of the cost. Your ability to say, do a pre-deployment site survey of a given area and identify what RF activity is already ongoing there so that you can tune your more sophisticated asset that you're going to be flying there is massive, right? Providing start points for the other, whether they be ground-based or air-based capabilities to go look at that can't look at 3 million, 10 million square kilometers at a time is going to really, really be a good steward of government, or private resources when it comes to using our data with other data sets. For assured access and reliability, we're seeing an increased importance with some of our customers on what's been deemed a hybrid space architecture, right? So we know in great power competition that, we may lose access to some, national collection assets that would otherwise have been used to provide a capability. And so being able to have a backbone of commercial providers that are already integrated into that hybrid space architecture and provide that level of resiliency is massive. So on the next couple slides here, I know I want to get to leave some time for Q&A as well. I'll quickly go through a couple of vignettes, and I'm happy to touch base more on these for folks, just to show that we have an abundance of teams that are actively working to develop insights, both based on our customers' individual needs, as well as interest across the industry for global events where we know that folks want to know what is going on and want to see what commercial can bring to the table. So in this instance, looking at the Chinese-India border, I think it was primarily L-band that was used here. We identified, RF activity as a key indicator of human activity and worked with our partners at Planet to collect some EO over the area. What we saw from that, was some very clear identification of military signals of interest, so L-band satellite comms that were then tipped and queued an EO asset to identify these forward stage locations where conflict was about to ensue. This was in May of 2020. Similar here, refining collect and pushing out some of that EO collect as well. We were able to identify areas where previously, folks hadn't known that there were increased tensions and that there was a buildup of forces. So border security, border monitoring is something that our data is very, very applicable to. We're doing this across the globe, not just in this area. You're seeing instances of our data being used to do this in areas of interest such as Yemen. The Russian-Ukrainian border is another significant one. And then quickly I'll showcase here another example of a maritime vignette that we did looking in another area of strategic interest, the South China Sea in this case, where along the Mischief Reef, we all know this is a contested region between China and the Philippines, and our data, in this case VHF and L-band geolocations, confirming and corroborating with EO sensors the active utilization of the area for fishing by Chinese vessels, as well as likely military buildup in vessels in the area. Quickly, one last example here in the Scarborough Shore as another one, similarly contested region in which we saw dark activity. This being vessels turning off their AIS, and yet our ability to still geolocate communications between those vessels using VHF and L-band comms to try to fill in those gaps of AIS. In this case, we used, again, our great partners at Planet, took some imagery that is highly probable to be associated with Chinese Coast Guard vessels in this case. And it looks like we are right on time here at 11:21 to take some questions if folks have any.
Thank you so much, Alex, and also thank you so much for mentioning the podcast. That interview was with me. If you're interested, John Serafini, their CEO, did an excellent podcast interview. We talked about a lot of players in Hawkeye 360 space are attempting to reach like 100 different markets, and Hawkeye is very government focused. If you want to submit questions, submit them through the Q&A tab. Once again, there's also, if you go to the handouts tab, you have Alex's contact information there, as well as some information in regards to the presentation. So I'll just start. The first question is just, I know you're, Alex, you're not an engineer to say, but like, what are some of the unique challenges, or also how do you maintain orientation of your 3 satellite clusters flying in formation?
Yeah, so we have gone with a couple different, since our Pathfinder cluster, essentially thrusting capabilities. And so one of the things that's unique about how we do our geolocations and how we achieve such a high accuracy is exactly that, flying in formation with one of those satellites oscillating between the two to give us that variance as we go over an area, and get multiple looks at a given emitter as we come over in a pass, to really refine that geolocation. Our space team does some amazing work operating these, yeah, if there's more specific answers I can provide on that one, I'm happy to pass those RFIs on to them.
Mm-hmm. Okay, excellent. Our next question is about data security. Just are there any like legal guidelines for when you collect ELANT domestically, and can you share that data with allies?
So it does vary quite a bit. There are some specific signals that we'll only provide to USG. Certainly that's the case for raw IQ in most cases, but we're always willing to and looking to work with USG to ensure that we're maximizing the shareability of the data, right? We really want to leverage the fact that we're a commercial entity to avoid kind of that pre 9/11 stovepiping of information where we overclassify and overprotect, as opposed to enabling the IC and our partner ICs to use our data to its utmost potential. And I can talk, if there's specific questions about encryption of data as it gets downlinked, I'm happy to answer those for folks, or field those over email as well.
Brandon, you mentioned your collection frequency range. What about the power output?
Yeah, so power output of the emitter is obviously a really large factor in our ability to geolocate something with a high level of accuracy. General good rule of thumb is probably I think we've done geolocations where we see in a low signal to noise ratio environment down to 1.5 watts power output, and in a higher SNR environment, right, a more urban area, for instance, ideally you're looking at from low Earth orbit closer to 5 watts power output is probably what you want to find. The great thing about really trying to divide between kind of the conventional mindset on imagery footprints is thinking through RF, the emitter gets a say into whether or not it's geolocated or imaged, so to speak. And so there may be cases where you have such a strong power output in an emitter that even outside of that say $7-10 million swath, you're able to geolocate it.
Next question is, what are your revisit rates to a particular region?
Yeah, so it does vary. Obviously we're a polar orbit, and so those mid-lats are the ones that are going to have the longest wait time in some cases. But right now, with 3 clusters on orbit, typically every hour and a half, depending on, again, where specifically in the world we're talking about.
All right. Also, Alex, you must have done well with your presentation. You guys have got a couple of people that all start their question with "Great presentation." But the question here is there a concept of intercepting communications using this capability, or just detecting and tracking objects?
Yeah, so that one, hearkening back to the, legal constraints with things, typically we are only demodulating things that have no expectation of privacy, right? So demodulating AIS. There are instances for, for instance, with VHF where we can, listen to some sections of hear voice on things where that expectation of privacy is not there. And so that is a capability. It's currently being productized. But yeah, we really do focus more on the ELINT versus, say, the comment, component to this currently.
Next question is, how many satellite clusters do you need for full operational capability?
Yeah, we are FOC today. We are ready to go support operational end users. I think as that revisit rate decreases and the latency, increases and the latency decreases, those use cases become stronger, right? So for tactical end users, having the ability to really get not persistent but near persistent looks over areas, multiple SOIs over areas in some instances, then you're really going to see the data shine. But today we're currently using this to secure border regions, to work with customers to identify emissions of interest.
And again, I would recommend that you go to viasatellite.com and listen to the podcast I did with John. It was just back in October. He pretty much laid out the next 18-month schedule for the company, which is pretty intense.
So yeah, I'll say in that too, Jeff, and I don't know if John mentioned it too, but I've sat with a lot of government end users who are keenly aware that right now the data as it flows in is still very impressive. But I've heard the feedback from a lot of folks being, hey, we need to be ready to receive the data when it's this massive influx, when the pipe's really open and it's constant revisit and the data's coming in, a dozen times a day. I mean, having the systems in place, the analyses and workflows built, that's where it's really important for us to work with customers now, so that even if it's just a pilot or a smaller scope provision of data, they're building those workflows, they're building those expertise so that they can handle it when the data is coming in from a much larger constellation.
Next question is, can you fingerprint a particular emitter and provide a historical track of its movement?
So on our technical roadmap is the capability to do what we call unique signal recognition. And so we are working with folks to build out a similar capability to what's being described there, and are always looking for sponsors for that capability, particularly within government end users that can really guide where we focus our efforts there.
And this will be our last question because we're just about out of time, but as well as determining the emitter frequency and geolocation, do you capture the RF emission burst for further analysis? Also, with the overlapping swaths, can you retrieve a full emission?
We do capture a number of bursts, and one of the metadata fields that we typically provide is the number of bursts that have been received. And what was the second part of that question?
Let me go back to it, sorry. Also, with the overlapping swaths, can you retrieve the full emission?
I would say if I'm understanding that question right, it likely depends on the emission. And so if you have something that's continually emitting over a period, the satellites are all turning on and detecting it. Our duty cycle is them looking at the same time. So yes, in that case, if it's something where it's maybe emitting, turning off, and then emitting over a period while we're overhead, there may be an instance in which it's worthwhile to point multiple satellites at a given time at a specific area and cover those gaps. But it all depends on the basically the business case for an end user that is that concerned with looking at the data.
Well, we're just